a Superman action figure in a toy coffin, a blue shirt and red jacket, a first flight in the sun above the Arctic tundra. These are some of the moments that define my Superman fandom. Together on this podcast, we journey across time and media to examine, discover, and reconsider the creative visions that have shaped the Man of Steel. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me for part 4 of Crisis Til Death is returning guest, Scott Honig. Scott, welcome back.
Hey, thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited to get to talk about these comics.
Did I give you enough homework for this episode?
Yeah, I actually had told my kids to leave me alone because I was doing my homework, and they asked what it was. I said Superman comics, and they couldn't believe it.
Listen, what better homework could you ask for? But this was no light lift here. We read, by my count, 53 issues across Superman, Adventures of Superman, and Action Comics. I'll give the issues in a moment for anyone who wants to know. But in this episode, we are going to be covering the immediate post-John Byrne era of the Superman titles from the late 80s. And the tentpole storyline of this era was Superman in Exile. And before we get into more of the specifics, you and I were talking off mic fairly recently about how you were reading these issues. And I'm going to spare our audience another rant about the DC app. I've done enough of that, and I think my feelings are known at this point. But I know that there were some out of print trades that you were able to read a good bit of the run from that. But otherwise, you did read on the app, but you read in a way that I was very surprised by. Would you mind sharing?
Sure. So I have the trade for the Superman Exile storyline, which I don't think is still in print. I read the other issues on the DC Infinite app, but I read them on my phone. I don't have my own tablet, so I wanted it to be portable. So I was reading it on my phone, but I was reading it specifically in the panel-to-panel view because you really can't decipher the text of a full page on a screen that size. So what was interesting about it was when you read panel to panel, every panel is like a page turn in a regular comic, right? It's all a surprise. It's all a big cliffhanger. So I was surprised constantly, which was fun.
So Scott basically had like thousands of cliffhangers over the course of this reading assignment, which is fascinating. I do read digitally, and I did read basically everything for this episode via the app, except for the few issues that they didn't have, which I bought on eBay. And but I've never really been a fan of the guided view, but I certainly understand if you're dealing with a phone and not a tablet, that just for the sake of your eyes, that's the way to go. So in terms of what our reading assignment was for this episode, for anyone who is curious and wants to know specifically what we read, Superman issues 23 through 43, Action Comics 643 to 652 plus annual number 2, and Adventures of Superman numbers 445 through 465. Now you might note that the action list was shorter than the other ones, and that's because for a period of time, Action went weekly and Superman was not the featured player. And once Superman returned to Action Comics and it returned to a monthly schedule, it sort of rejoined the rest of the Super books, and that's when we folded it into our reading assignment. So for the first bit of our reading, we were really dealing primarily with 2 titles here. And in terms of the creators, at the beginning of this, we had Jerry Ordway writing and drawing Adventures of Superman, and we had Roger Stern and Kerry Gamble, I don't know if I'm saying that right, on the Superman title. Eventually, we would get a little bit of shuffling of the creative teams, and Ordway ended up on Superman. We had Dan Jurgens on Adventures, and we had Roger Stern as well as George Perez for a period. And I don't think he ended up doing quite as much as was originally intended, because he started on Action writing and drawing, and then he ended up, I think it was more plotting and inking or layout, stuff like that. But in any event, those are the primary creators for the issues we read. Now, there's so much to unpack, and I just want to lay this out for our audience right at the top. You and I spoke about this off mic. we're not going to be doing an issue by issue breakdown here. These episodes are long enough to begin with, and we'd be here forever. So, we'll be talking about, the major storylines, the major themes, the characterization, what was going on with each character and relationship. I think that's sort of how we will be organizing our conversation, not really doing an issue by issue analysis here. I think there are other podcasts, for something like that. But let me ask you, Scott, and this is often a question that I begin with, with guests, especially when we're talking about a reading project like this. I mean, what were your overall impressions? And I guess more than anything else, did you enjoy this?
I did, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. Not that I thought that I wouldn't like it, but look, we all know that the '90s, particularly the early '90s, kind of get a bad rap. That it's not particularly well known for being sort of fertile ground for classic or great comics. So I wasn't really sure what to expect. I hadn't read most of these issues ever before. I'd read around it. Certainly, obviously, we're leading up to what will be the death of Superman and kind of moving forward. So I knew stylistically a little bit what I was getting myself into, but I was really impressed. They were more than anything fun. They were just fun comics. I was impressed with the way that everything came together across 3 different titles. The way that they were interwoven across those titles, because you don't have one plot in the Superman book, one in action and one in adventures. They really are. It's sort of a rotating thing. Obviously, they were coming out one book one week, then the next book next week, and so fans started to get on that Superman train. Where pretty much every week of the month, almost, you get a new chapter, and the storylines continue throughout. So it's funny, having listened to your previous episodes on the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, it was really easy to kind of slot this in, because as you mentioned in those episodes, the Golden Age had the origin, and then it was really Superman as a social crusader. It was developing the power set, figuring out really who this character is going to be. And then in the Silver Age, largely because of the comics code and all that, the stories became pretty silly. There's some fun ones, but they're kind of goofy. And then the Bronze Age became a little bit more serious, more experimental, but for the most part still self-contained stories. And now here in the early '90s, we get this juggling act among the creators. That's going to lead to what we know is this sort of triangle, the famous triangle era, where you have to actually keep track of which books go in which order, otherwise you'll be lost.
It's funny because when I announced this mini-series event here, this weekly event of episodes, and one of the episodes, actually our next one, is titled Dawn of the Triangle Era. And when I listed them all out on social media, one of my friends was like, "What's the Triangle Era?" And I was like, "Oh boy, are you in for a treat." I echo everything you said. And I mean, I have to tell you, I so enjoyed this reading project. And I got a huge smile on my face. For anyone who's not watching us on YouTube, if you're listening, I have a huge smile on my face. I was looking forward to this part of the reading project more than pretty much anything else. I mean, not that I wasn't looking forward to the Byrne issues, but, and I don't say this in a dismissive way, but I kind of just saw them as something. It's like, I have to get through these. And I ended up enjoying most of that reading, really, for the most part. But I was really excited to get here because, again, as everyone knows, I started with the death of Superman, and basically all of the creators were talking about, over this episode and the next 2 episodes, which you will be my guest for these next 3 parts. They're the same creators who are still working on the books at that time. And there's so much stuff that they're laying the groundwork for even here that will come to fruition when I started reading. So to get to see all of this stuff get set up and introduced was so cool. And just beyond that, I mean, the story, they are really, really strong. I mean, these were not issues that I read in an academic sense. These weren't issues that I read just to get some context or some continuity. I mean, I've genuinely enjoyed these. I mean, I think these guys who are working on these books were really, really firing on all cylinders. I mean, you were on this show at the very beginning of this podcast, I think episode 2, and we talked about the Jeff Loeb era of the Superman titles from the early 2000s. And you know, there are parts of that era that I think really held up well. Other parts that I probably remembered better than they actually were. That still holds a very special place for me, just at the age that I was when those issues came out and everything. But I I don't know. I think by the time we're done with these next few episodes, I think this era leading up to the death of Superman might supplant the Loeb era as my favorite period of the super titles. I'm gonna go so far as to say that I was so impressed.
That is a bold statement. I didn't expect you to say that. No, what's funny is so you and I think are about a decade apart in age, right? So the age that you were when you discovered the Loeb Kelly era, that was the age I was during these stories, and I wasn't reading them, right? So I also sort of jumped in at the death of Superman. So this was all stuff that sort of just passed me by a little bit. And because it's never been, these are not the stories that, when you ask people in the know, what Superman stories must I read, right? What's really important? Nobody goes to this era, right? They don't say, well, you should read the Dan Jurgens and Roger Stern era in the early 90s, right? They might point to Byrne, and they might point to Dan Jurgens a little bit later with the death of Superman. But this stuff that slots in the middle, it's generally not, at the forefront of people's brains. It's not on those, top 10 lists or anything like that. So I feel like had I read them at that age, I probably would have felt about these stories the way that you feel about the Loeb era. But I felt reading them now at 43 kind of like a 12-year-old. I got that much joy out of them, discovering them for the first time and just getting in touch with this style of storytelling, which I really haven't read probably since I was a teenager. It was a real joy.
I'm so glad that you enjoyed this project. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to really sink your teeth into with these issues. I mean, the writers were really weaving a very rich tapestry of the supporting cast and primary storylines and subplots. And there are certain issues, particularly early in this run, where Superman is still racked with guilt over killing the villains from the Pocket universe. And I think it's actually the first issue of Adventures that's part of our reading project here, where Superman doesn't appear for like the first good chunk of the issue. And there's so much going on, and you're so invested in the other characters that it's like you almost don't even notice. So yeah, what they were doing, and again, the seeds that they were planting that would come to fruition later. I mean, it was really quite a feat. I mean, if we were to take a look at, again, these 53 issues, I think they kind of fall into two big buckets. One would be the lead up to Exile, where Superman is racked with guilt over killing the Pocket Universe villains. He has a psychotic break and, unbeknownst to himself, starts going out at night as the vigilante gangbuster. And upon realizing what he's done and realizing the risk that he's putting the Earth at, he decides to exile himself into space. And he goes on this journey of self-discovery. And that's sort of, I think, the first big bucket that we can kind of put these issues into. And then for the second one, I think if we had to boil it down to one word, it would have to be Eradicator. So at the end of the Exile story, Superman comes into the possession of this Kryptonian device, and it's his first tangible connection to his home world. And over the course of, again, like the second half of the issues we read, the Eradicator would create this mental link between Superman and Matrix. The Eradicator creates the fortress in the Antarctic. The Eradicator, and eventually in the final storyline that we read, Day of the Krypton Man, basically reprograms Superman and turns him into this cold, calculating Kryptonian persona. So that's really the meat of this run here. So for people who have read it, I'm sure that will ring a lot of bells. And for anyone who hasn't read the run, who's maybe just kind of curious about it, big picture, those are sort of like the major arcs, in terms of what we read.
Yeah, the build up to Exile was much shorter than the build up to Day of the Krypton Man. It felt almost like they were, Bronze Age one-offs. You had a Silver Banshee story in there, you had a Rampage story, you had a Brainiac story that who would ever have known at that point how long that thing would get dragged out? You've got a couple of the stories with the Thanagarian invasion, the gangbuster stuff, and then there's a Guardian appearance at the end, and all of it serves to with its subplot serves to lead us to the eventual decision to exile himself, and then he's gone for a while, and we watch him out in space, and we watch how the supporting cast, deals with a Supermanless Earth. Um, but then coming out of exile, you really don't know where it's going, right? All these plots sort of dovetail, and there are a lot of them. There are a lot of characters that these creators are juggling. And so, one of the things you'll notice, especially depending on which title you're reading at a time, different characters sort of come to the fore in various titles. There's a certain A plot, and then there's a B, a C, and sometimes a D plot, and it'll run for a certain period, and then that B plot will rise to take the place of the A plot as the A plot gets resolved, and then C and D move up as well, and you just kind of get this rotating, arcing kind of sequence, which is I can't imagine as writers how difficult that is to achieve, but it works for the most part. I mean, a couple of hiccups I think in there, but for the most part, I think it really, really works. And what's neat about doing that in the build up to Day of the Krypton Man is because because of the nature of that story, which essentially thematically is asking, you know, what how does one person balance essentially three different aspects of himself? He is Clark Kent, he is Kal-El, and he is Superman. And can he be all three of those? And can he have a life in which he fulfills all three of those parts of his personality? When he begins to pull away from his Clark Kent identity, right? Choosing to eschew emotion for pure logic. We see those little hints like it wouldn't be logical to do this, or this is the only logical decision. As a reader, I think you feel as off put and as uncomfortable as the characters do interacting with him, because his relationship starts to really fall apart. Jimmy, his parents, Lana, Lois, Perry White. Ends up leaving the Daily Planet for a while and going somewhere else. So, you know, I was uncomfortable until I realized where it was all going, and then I went, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah, that in particular was a gem of a story. I mean, I agree with what you said earlier. I think, when people are making recommendations about Superman stories and runs, especially, if they're talking about this period of time, it's like, yeah, they'll likely tell you to read Man of Steel, and then they'll probably jump to Death of Superman. Maybe Exile. And I know DC, to their credit, I guess, they did put out that Exile omnibus a little while back that collected that whole storyline. But Day of the Krypton Man, I think, was really an underrated gem. And I know that's the end of what we read, but man, the fact that the Kents are the ones who come to his rescue, I love that so much. And, it just rang so true. It's like they're talking to Kal-El on the phone, right? And he's just so dismissive. And, he goes to visit the farm for Lana's birthday, and he's just so cold and standoffish. And they know that something's wrong. And, we're not at a point in the story yet where Lois is in on this. Like, it's just the Kents and Lana, but poor Lana's been put through enough. It's like Jonathan and Martha, like, that's it. That's the rescue squad. And it's like they get on a plane and they come to Metropolis and they end up in the fortress, and like they're able to get through to him. And it's like, one of the massive changes, between pre and post crisis was the fact that now the Kents are alive. And I feel like a story like this shows like why it's so impactful to have them. It's like their boy was in trouble, and like they went and got him and they set him straight. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, I know you're always a fan of having the Kents be around and alive for Superman stories, and I echo that. I mean, this is a story that justifies that decision. The fact that they were able to get through to him, but they did it. They appealed to what was clearly Kal-El's need for logic, right?
Right.
That yes, they're appealing to his emotions, right? They're saying, you're our son, we're your parents, we love you, we raised you. So there is that emotional appeal, but there is also that logical appeal where they say, well, if you wanted to cut all of your ties with all the people you have any feelings for, why did you have your robots pack these photographs of you with your parents and you with Lana on the farm? And he doesn't really have an answer for it because it wasn't logical, right? According to whatever Kryptonian directive he had in his head. So they were smart enough, right, to go at both aspects of him at once, and that's what broke him.
Yeah, no, I love that. You know, it's funny. I wasn't thinking this at the time, but it calls to mind. Of course, it always comes back to Smallville. At the beginning of season 9 of Smallville, Clark has turned his back on his human side after the death of one of his friends. I won't spoil it, I guess, even though the show's been over for 10 years. But anyway, so at the start of the season 9, you know, this is when he's wearing the black shirt and trench coat, and he's finally started his training at the fortress with Jor-El. Yet he keeps coming back to the farm to feed the dog. And Chloe calls him out on that. She's like, well, there's really nothing more human than like still taking care of the dog. And so it's like, yeah, there's always going to be that tie. While we're talking about the Kents, one of my favorite scenes in this is right before Superman exiles himself. He goes to the farm to say goodbye, and he finally, you know, unburdens himself and tells Ma and Pa what he did to those criminals in the Pocket universe. And what I loved about their reaction was that they didn't coddle him, but they didn't lecture him. I really felt like they engaged with him almost more as peers. I mean, I really loved the counsel that they offered. And, you know, especially for Jonathan, someone who's been to war, I think he was able to relate to Clark. And he's like, you know, listen, what you're experiencing is probably not dissimilar from what I felt, or, you know, a police officer who, you know, might shoot someone in the line of duty. And I thought that was really powerful. And again, the fact that he is saying goodbye to them at that point in the story, again, I think that's another benefit of having them alive in this, because if this were a pre-crisis story, there's no one really for him to say goodbye to. So I really thought that was great. And again, those are a couple of examples of, you know, the value, I think, of having the Kents alive in this.
Yeah, and for as moral as Jonathan Kent is, right? That's where Superman gets the compass, you know, the moral compass from. He recognizes, number one, he has to trust his now adult son to do what's right, to make his own choices. He is an adult, right? He's no longer living under the Kent roof, but also understands that while Jonathan is there as counsel, if Clark ever needs it, he will never understand what it is to be Superman. Only one person does, and that's Clark. So Clark is going to make the decisions he makes with that moral compass that Jonathan gave him. But at the end of the day, Jonathan can't cast aspersions on him because he has no idea what it's like.
Scott, that calls to mind a scene from the series finale of Smallville. It does. There, you know, the final scene of guidance between Jonathan and Clark, where Jonathan's like, my guidance is just not enough. Anyway, I won't keep bringing up that, but it always comes back to Smallville. I love these connection points, and I have more to say on that. But actually, one other thing that is Jonathan and Martha related. We read 53 issues. You probably know exactly how many panels since you went one by one, but I actually can tell you I have a favorite panel in the entire 53 issues, and it's towards the end of the Exile storyline. At this point, you know, Superman has been captured by Mongol and forced to compete as a gladiator, and he fights Draga. I guess we'll go with that pronunciation. It calls to mind Drago, and given that Rocky IV came out just around this time, I can't help but think if there was maybe a little connection there. But, you know, they're supposed to fight to the death, and of course Superman, you know, especially at this point, having killed, you know, he's now resolved not to do that. And so he rejects the orders that he's given, and he spares Draga's life. Draga, a warrior, a born warrior, feels this is, you know, he's been dishonored. It's either kill or be killed. He can't be spared. He can't be saved. And not only does Superman spare him, but then in subsequent battles, he proceeds to save Draga numerous times. And Draga, in frustration, calls him out on this. He's like, what? you were supposed to kill me, yet you keep saving me. Why? And Superman, he's been through the ringer at this point, and he's weak and he's kind of weary, but he says it's just the way I was brought up, I guess. And that's my favorite panel in these 53 issues.
Ah, that's so good. I had forgotten about it, but I'm so glad that you reminded me. Yeah, I mean, there's a moment too where he's not wearing his costume. He's wearing sort of rags and things. His hair is all grown out. He's got this beard. I mean, he's just a mess because he's been away from home and he's been in the arena and essentially he's beaten Draga, but he will not land the killing blow. And in defiance, right, he sort of throws up his fists toward wherever Mongol happens to be watching from, and he just says, "Superman doesn't kill," and he like screams it. So it's inspiring to see how far he's been pushed and that he won't do that. But then again, knowing, as you said, where that comes from, right? Because he had done it. And to watch him come back from it, it's great. These were some really good character stories, that being alone out in space, right, without the supporting cast, their stories continue, but they're not there with him. That it allows us really to shine the spotlight on Superman, as Superman comics should every now and again. But I thought this was a really smart conceit, the Exile conceit, in allowing us to see, who Superman really is. Because again, everything leading up to this is Superman in Metropolis, interacting with an increasingly large supporting cast.
Yeah. So first, I just want to say that, that scene where he defies Mongol and he calls Mongol out and he's like, "Come down here and face me yourself." It was such a badass moment. I loved it. And I love the beard. That's actually why I did not shave for this, in honor of the beard. Now, my beard pales in comparison to what Superman was able to grow during his time in space. Nevertheless, it's my slight homage. But your point is great. And I actually wasn't thinking about that, but it's very true, because I do love the supporting cast, and I think these writers did a great job of really building them out and making them feel real. And that's why I think, when he is exiled during this storyline, and then when he's dead, after his fight with Doomsday, you're still invested because now you've bought into these characters. However, to your point, and I do think it's a valid one, if there are so many characters he's interacting with, and I think you do sometimes run the risk of then defining the character in terms of, again, how the others are seeing him. And certainly by the time we got to the late 90s, I know a criticism of the books was that the supporting cast had really ballooned. We were getting spending a lot of time with characters maybe who didn't necessarily warrant, that much page time at the expense of the main character. So yeah, I agree with you. I think, sending him off into space the way they did was really effective. I also think that, and I'm not a psychologist. I took psychology for a semester in college. I loved it, but I didn't pursue it. But I think that this was a surprisingly sophisticated depiction of guilt in this storyline. His guilt over killing, because and however many issues it ended up running, it was a good chunk of issues when we're talking about the lead up and then Exile. And for the most part, he's running away from the guilt internally, and that leads to the creation of this gangbuster persona physically when he literally leaves Earth. And it's only at the end of the story where he meets the cleric, who, we'll talk more about, and cleric is able to share all this insight into the history of Krypton with him. But, he has this heart-to-heart with cleric and finally confronts what he's done and and finally processes it. And I think that that was very meaningful. Again, that we had all these issues of him running from it, and it's only when he confronted it, and it's only when he, with cleric's help, kind of came to this realization that even if it was a mistake, even if it was a sin, the greater sin would be depriving the world of its greatest hero because of this guilt that he's feeling. And, he's finally able to return the right way. And I was really impressed, I think from that sort of psychological perspective. I mean, did that work for you?
It did. I mean, the many issues that we read, I see cycles of guilt, right? It's not just one instance of guilt and then he deals with it and moves on, right? When we picked up with these issues, he is, again, he's dealing with the guilt from having, killed some criminals. Uh, that leads him to become gangbuster unknowingly. And then when as you said, when he realizes what he's been doing, then that leads to a new round of guilt. And that's why he exiles himself, right? Because he has to go, he has to, make sure that Earth is safe from him, right? And so he's now processing that guilt. And then when he comes back, right, when he comes back and he has the Eradicator and realizes that the Eradicator is responsible, at least at first, for all of the weirdness going on with Jimmy Olsen.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I mean, they took pages right out of the Silver Age with that stuff. I mean, he's stretching, he loses his hair, it's all kinds of weird stuff. But he's dealing with guilt from that too, right? The fact that, his best pal is going through an ordeal because of him. And so a lot of these stories deal with Superman doing the best he can with what he's got, being there for as many people as possible, but also failing in a lot of ways at the same time. So it does ask questions about, is it better to have him there? Is it better to not have him there? I think those are valid questions, meta questions for the readers, the audience to ask as well.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And I think, there was a high level of relatability in these stories, in terms of what he was wrestling with. I enjoyed it a lot. A question that I had, and I'll pose it to you. I'll pose it to our audience because, the thing I went into this, I guess I haven't addressed this yet. Before this reading project, I had read a little bit. At one point in time, I did own the original Exile trade paperback that's now out of print. And that is during one of my collection prunings, I got rid of it. You're holding it up now. That's exactly the one. Right? That's the one that I had. So as a kid, I did have that at one point and I did read it. And I don't think it has like all the lead up stuff necessarily with Gangbuster. It probably just has the main story. Right. But, so I had read that, and that was about it as far as what I had previously read. But from that, and just from reading about Superman, and, it's been referenced in subsequent storylines, I knew that Superman was Gangbuster. I knew that going into the story. I guess the question I had for anyone who read it cold, not knowing, was it obvious? Okay, so did you know where that was going? Could you see where the seeds that they were planting?
I didn't. I knew that there was a Gangbuster character. I remember him being there in a couple of random stories I must have read throughout the 90s. And when we got to the other Gangbuster identity, Jose Delgado, then it registered. Oh, right, that's who Gangbuster was. I had no idea about the previous incarnation that was Clark. I had no idea.
Okay. So, because as I was reading it, I said to myself, like, would it be clear that it's like, okay, clearly this is going to be Superman? And I think they did a really interesting job with it because, and the way this plays out for anyone who hasn't read it in a while or hasn't read it at all, Clark is perpetually tired no matter how much sleep he gets. So there are clues like that something is amiss. And this new Gangbuster, because Gangbuster, we talked about this in prior episodes, the Jose Delgado character and his Gangbuster alias, these were introduced in prior storylines, and ultimately Jose was injured and paralyzed defending Lois, and he was off the board. And then this new Gangbuster showed up. And often the Gangbuster would show up like right after Superman was like knocked out and missing. And all of a sudden Gangbuster would show up. And there were numerous remarks from the people he was fighting. Like, wow, like nothing can hurt this guy. And he's leaping farther than a normal person necessarily would. At the same time, they did give us a couple of red herrings. There was the former employee of LexCorp, Amanda McCoy, I think, from Superman #2. She had ran that computer program and deduced that Clark was Superman, and Lex rejected that notion and fired her. And so in these issues, she's hired a PI to try to prove that Clark is Superman. And there was at least one instance where I think Gangbuster had been fighting underwater or something, and then the PI, in the next scene, we see the PI showing up, with Amanda, and he's wet. And he's like, oh, I just washed my face. So they gave you at least one, and there were a couple of other red herrings where it's like, okay, maybe it could be this person. But the thing I kept coming back to is I feel like if I had been reading this cold, I would not have suspected Superman, just because that was a very severe turn. Like, I just would have assumed, like, there's no way his psyche has been damaged that severely that he would be going out and not realizing it. So I think it was a really cool twist. And again, for people who, are out there, if, whether you were surprised or not, I would love to hear from you. I was very curious about that, for people who read it cold. Because again, I went in knowing that, but I kept thinking it all along.
Well, I also think it's something that you can do when you're telling stories like this, where you have such a large and rotating cast of characters, and the each issue is a series of quick cuts, scene to scene to scene to scene. Right? I mean, there's 15, 20 scenes in a 22-page comic, where every page and a half, 2 pages at most, you're moving to another location with a new cast of characters. So I think it's easy when you describe it the way you just did and say, well, we saw this, then we saw this, then we saw this, but there's stuff in between all that in essence serves as a distraction, because while before you have time to process this gangbuster thing, or the reason why Clark is always tired, or the fact that he was wet, now over to Lois, or now over to Jimmy, or now over to the Kents, and you just forget about it. It really does distract you, in addition to providing a story for those characters as well, which have their own mysteries that will be solved down the road. So, again, the storytelling here becomes more sophisticated than we've seen from Superman comics in past eras. And it allows them to tell different kinds of stories and again, be more experimental like that.
You had mentioned earlier in the episode that there were occasionally some hiccups with the style of storytelling. I don't think that this actually falls into that category, because I don't really say this in a critical way. I think it was necessary, especially that this was a different way of telling, like, almost a weekly Superman story at this point. There's a lot of recapping in the issues. Like, I know, especially as we got deeper into it, it was like. And so sometimes, like, multiple pages where, like, Superman is thinking about everything that's been going on, and it's like, I know, I just read the issue of Superman that came before, I know. But again, I do think it's and again, like, these days in comics, we have recap pages and things like that. You didn't have something like that, so it was fine. I do think it was a necessary evil, and it wasn't anything horrible. But I did clock that. I was like, we get an awful lot of of recapping what's gone on the week or two prior.
We do, and that's also a product of the time where as you have the proliferation of a Superman family of titles, the expectation that any issue, any of these could have been somebody's first, and so they're jumping in. Imagine jumping in somewhere in the middle of these 53 issues. I mean, even jumping in where we jumped in without having the benefit of, for me anyway, I hadn't read or reread from the beginning of that Byrne era until here. So sometimes those recaps were actually really helpful because I was jumping in the middle. Once I got into the middle of our reading, I started finding less and less use for the recaps because I had just read it. But I read them. I may have read them a little bit more quickly, with the understanding that I know why they're here, right? I know what the philosophy behind this was. So if I have to, read a page and a half of recap, I'll suck it up.
Yeah, and I'll be honest. I've had a lot going on, and it's been a lot of issues to get through. And there were times where I was actually grateful for it, because especially if I had been up reading these issues like very late the night before, and then I started again the next day. Sometimes it wasn't the worst thing to get a little bit of that recap. Let's take a quick commercial break, and then we will continue our discussion. So we will be right back. If you enjoy this show, please make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. I also hope you'll consider joining my Patreon community. The support of my patrons enables me to produce this podcast, and patrons get rewards too, including exclusive episodes, advanced listens, and more. Sign up today and get instant access to the back catalog. Visit patreon.com/Anthony Desiato. Thank you to all of my patrons. I truly appreciate your support. The Hive Comics and Games is an oasis of nerd fun and events in the heart of Odessa, Texas. Whether it's comic book superhero stories or role-playing in a dungeon, the Hive is where to be. Come tap your mana and face off against the top Magic the Gathering players in West Texas. Hive carries a majority of new comic titles each Wednesday and has all of your favorite titles in their back issue section. Follow them on Facebook at The Hive Comics and on Instagram at The Hive Comic Shop. Film lovers and filmmakers should check out this family of film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and In the Cut in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals generally, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Also, be sure to listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts, available via a shared universe network. Finally, the next time you go to place an order at bcwsupplies.com, be sure to use the promo code FSP, that's for Flat Squirrel Productions, to save 10% on your order and support Digging for Kryptonite. So again, use promo code FSP the next time you order from bcwsupplies.com. All right, so we are back here. Scott, are you a fan of The Honeymooners, the classic 1950s sitcom?
So what's funny is I did not grow up in the 50s. I grew up in mostly the 80s and the 90s. However, my parents did grow up in the 50s, and so they sort of raised me on 50s, 60s, and 70s sitcoms. And so I've seen my fair share of The Honeymooners. I liked it as a kid. Now that I'm an adult, it's not as easy to watch, but I like aspects of it.
Okay, fair enough. So it has long been a favorite of mine. I do watch it every New Year's Eve, and it is one of my all-time favorites. So I was delighted when Draga needs transport to Earth to get his revenge on Superman, and his driver, he has a cab, but then his larger ship resembles a bus. So basically we have an outer space bus driver named Cramden, and it's spelled in an alien way, but it's Cramden, and he has a wife named Alice, and whenever he gets nervous, he says, humana, humana, humana. I was very delighted by that. That really tickled me.
Yeah, at one point he even says that if his wife, he would go home and tell his wife that he would send her to the moon, right?
Yes. Now, the to the moon part is the aspect of The Honeymooners that has not aged well, but nevertheless, it's so near and dear to me. I love that show, and I loved that reference. Another thing that did make me laugh, and they really played with it a lot in Action 650 appropriately, but the cab fare in Metropolis is always $6.50. Even before we got to Action 650, where they really had a lot of fun with that, I did notice that as I was making my way through, and I think even in some of the Byrne issues too. I mean, it was like $6.50 is like a standard fare no matter where you're going in Metropolis.
I know, and in one of the last issues that we read, when the Kents go to Metropolis, Jonathan Kent even gripes about 650 being highway robbery, and I'm thinking I would love to take a cab ride in New York for 650.
Yeah, it is very funny. So, one of the things that I really wanted to address is, and this is a theme, has been, and I think will continue to be a theme in this run of episodes where, again, like I said before, I'm seeing the groundwork that's being laid for future storylines, including the death of Superman and the subsequent years. And so it's cool to see, a number of those connection points. For example, Superman has this psychotic break, and he poses as gangbuster. When we get to Reign of the Supermen, when these 4 replacement Supermen show up, and 2 of them purport to be the real deal, it makes a lot more sense now that among like our core cast, it's like there is a little bit of a question of like maybe one of them is, because he has this history of pretending to be somebody else. So, that really rang true. And then, of course, and we'll talk about this when we get to Reign of the Supermen, but, Mongol plays a key role in that storyline. And, when I read that as a kid, it's like, okay, like obviously he's a bad guy and he destroys Coast City, but it's like now, well, you see that, Superman inspired this rebellion on Warworld, and, Mongol actually suffered for it. So the fact that he emerges as, one of the villains of Reign of the Superman, like that now has added weight to it. And I'm so excited to get back to that story now with this history. So, stuff like that. Oh, I mean, I'm not to mention the Eradicator, and I know we have a lot more to talk about there. Hank Henshaw. Hank Henshaw has a couple of brief appearances here where they're on the space shuttle and they're doing these radiation experiments. So it's like all this stuff to see it introduced, was really cool, and definitely I know, and that was the reason I structured these episodes this way, but I know when I get to Death, Funeral, Reign, and Return, I'm going to get a lot more out of it now because I have all of this context.
No, I feel the same way. I mean, I remember reading the death of Superman, and then following it into the four replacement Superman, and the Eradicator to me was a brand new character and concept at that time. Had no idea, just figured it was one of those four, never mentioned before that. So to see that not only is it mentioned, but it occupies, I want to say the majority of the main plot for, I'd say, the back three quarters of what we read. I mean, it's a huge ongoing thing. When you think it's over and done and settled, it comes back and it comes back and it comes back. And the last we see of it is he sort of thinks he's destroyed it, or at least rendered it inert. He wraps it up in his cape and he kind of takes it out into space and tosses it, I think, into a sun. And you're like, well, that's got to be the end, right? But it's years later, right? It's not even just that it immediately is going to follow, because we know that it's going to be years later that they pick up on it in the form of the Eradicator, the character, as opposed to the device. So yeah, it was really, really cool seeing the seeds planted for this.
And speaking of Eradicator specifically, remind me, did you watch Superman and Lois?
I did. I don't remember it all that well, but I did.
Oh, okay. So because and as of this
Oh, I'm
recording,
sorry, Superman and Lois. You're
yeah,
not.
not
I thought
not
you,
Lois
you
and
said
Clark.
Lois and Clark.
No, no.
I've seen the first 5 episodes of Superman and Lois.
Okay. So
Sorry.
I was I was going to say, Scott, it's pretty recent. I think you.
Yeah, no, those I remember. For some reason, it registered as Lois and Clark. No, yeah, I've seen the first 5 episodes.
Okay, I won't spoil anything. By the time this episode comes out, the season will have just finished. As of this recording, there's still a couple episodes left. And again, I won't get into heavy spoilers, other than to say that the Eradicator plays a big role in the season. And so the timing is very serendipitous that we're covering these issues just as the Eradicator, gets its live action adaptation. It's really, really cool. What I loved about the Eradicator was, other than the connection to Death of Superman, that was cool. But what I really liked was, and I've talked about this on the previous episodes, what I didn't like about Byrne's Man of Steel and his take on Superman generally, as much as there was a lot I did like, but what I didn't like was that, the emphasis was placed so much on the human side, but the Kryptonian side was really cast aside. And I know that was obviously clearly a choice, but at the end of Man of Steel, Clark, he gets all of these images and all this information and history about Krypton, and basically just comes to the conclusion, well, it's a world I'll never know. I was born on Earth. I'm a human, and that's kind of it. But what I loved about this was we start to now kind of bridge his two worlds. And there, I forget which title it was, but there was a cool moment that I thought really reconciled all of this, where Superman is thinking to himself, I never really felt much of a connection because it was a world that I thought I would never get to know. But now I have a tangible connection to it. And so that kind of changes the equation for him a little bit. And so I thought that was a great way to still, sort of respect what had been laid out post-crisis, but now to sort of kind of move forward a little bit. Because I do, and I know I say this a lot, but I do genuinely think there needs to be some tension there between the human and the Kryptonian sides. I just think for dramatic purposes, it's interesting.
No, I completely agree. I think you get better stories when you can explore different facets of the personality. I also liked, the fact that not only did he have the Eradicator, which I think by itself, yeah, it's a relic from Krypton, but I don't know that it would have done the job in terms of the story on its own. But the fact that, as you mentioned, it creates for him a new fortress, and not only is it just sort of the Antarctic fortress, but at the core of it, at the center of it, structurally, are these giant effigies of Jor-El and Lara holding up Krypton, right? So there is this tribute to his specific lineage, not only, not just the world at large, but his specific lineage, and the fact that he's able to learn about the planet as a whole, his role in it, his parents' struggle in it, get close to that, I think is so meaningful, and expands the stories in this particular era, that in ways that as you said, Byrne chose not to for whatever reason. I like you, I really appreciated that development.
Do you know if there's ever been a prop made of the Eradicator, a toy or anything? Because I can't think of anything. But as I was reading these issues, I just kept saying, I was like, man, I would love to own the Eradicator. As far as I know, I don't think they've done one, but I'll double check.
I bet someone out there has done one, but I don't think there's been like a mass market production of
Yeah. Well, so I know we've been talking about the Eradicator a lot, and yes, it is this Kryptonian device, and it debuts towards the end of the Exile storyline. Superman encounters this ancient prophet named the Cleric, and he has been in possession of the Eradicator, and we get through the end of that storyline and the subsequent Eradicator issues, we get a bit more of the Kryptonian history fleshed out here. So basically. And Byrne had done a lot with this and setting up the world of Krypton, and specifically in that World of Krypton miniseries. And basically, there was this tension. The Kryptonians would, grow clones and use them for replacement parts. Basically, it led to this huge civil war between those who thought that that was an abomination, versus, the more of the, proponents of science. And so we find out that the Cleric, visited Krypton and preached against, the evils of cloning. And that the scientists, created this device, specifically Kal-El, an ancestor of Kal-El, created this Eradicator weapon. Of course, it's more than just a weapon, but, it did create this explosion, and it also bound the Kryptonians to Krypton, such that they would die if they left. And that's ultimately what happens when the Cleric takes a bunch of his followers away from Krypton. They sadly perish in the ship. And again, overall, this idea that the Eradicator is trying to preserve the legacy of Krypton. But so it bound the Kryptonians to the planet, and it was only due to Jor-El's machinations that he was able to remove that limitation so that Kal-El could leave. And it also made it such that outsiders would not be able to survive on Krypton. So it really plays into this whole xenophobia aspect on Krypton, which is interesting, in that they really wanted to keep Krypton pure and free of outside influence, especially after this prophet, the Cleric, had, kind of got everyone up in arms about the cloning. So, you get all of that. And so the Cleric, gives Superman the Eradicator at the end of that storyline, and it creates a new costume for him, which ultimately he has to discard at the end of the Day of the Krypton Man storyline, when he, was totally finally free of the Eradicator's influence. But that was interesting too, because, for the first time, it wasn't just that, his costume wasn't getting destroyed because of the aura around him, but he actually had a stronger costume, and the cape now was finally staying intact. And of course, again, he loses it at the end of that Day of the Krypton Man storyline. But anyway, the Eradicator, again, I think it really helped flesh out the history of Krypton, and it was that tangible connection. And yes, it was literally a plot device. I mean, it was responsible for all those things we talked about. But yeah, it was. I was really there. I was really intrigued by it. What about you?
Yeah, the thing I like the most about it is that it's not just a plot device, but it's specifically that classic monkey's paw. It's he's Kal-El is so excited about having this, as you said, tangible tie to Krypton, this thing that will allow him to learn more about his Kryptonian side, right? To have a connection that he never had before. But then you watch as it just keeps going wrong and wrong and wrong, and in more ways, right? I mean, the first we see of it is, it is presumed by Dr. Emil Hamilton that the Eradicator is responsible for somehow altering Jimmy Olsen's body chemistry, DNA, something, and he becomes this stretchy guy. But it's not even just the silliness of the Silver Age device, right? Because that's a Silver Age
Yeah.
carryover, but it's physically excruciatingly painful for him Superman's trying to kind of hold him together, and every time he touches him at the points of contact, Jimmy is screaming in agony. So it's what at first seems to be kind of funny, and in the Silver Age it would have been, now has a weight to it, an emotional weight to it. It's a point of conflict, and that becomes that relationship between Jimmy and Superman becomes severely damaged as a result of the Eradicator's influence, because Jimmy begins to resent Superman, number one, for doing this to him in the first place, but then also for not making it his number one priority to fix it. And we understand why he can't, right? I mean, he is in service to the entire world, and he can't just stick around and focus on the problems of one guy, but it's his best pal. So Jimmy, I think, is justified in thinking that, listen, before you start running off and, dealing with that tsunami, which is one, a thing that happens, right? Can we figure this out first, please? And he becomes really resentful. And that is not resolved by the time that we finish these issues.
That's right. I know. I was going to say that. I mean, that was, that was unexpected. And I like that a lot. I mean, it's, I think it's a dynamic that we've really not, seen explored prior. I mean, these events really do drive a wedge between Superman and his pal. And, I think it's in part attributable to the Eradicator's influence, because this, and there is also a lot of tension between Superman and Dr. Hamilton, where Hamilton's like constantly calling him out. He's like, why weren't you here sooner? Like, this is your friend. And again, the word logical gets thrown around, a lot there too. But, I'm looking forward to seeing how it is resolved in the subsequent issues. But it was cool to see that come into play. As I talked about this in previous issues, I felt like the immediate post-crisis Jimmy, I don't know, didn't really offer that much more than we had seen before. And I feel like in these issues, we're really actually fleshing that character out. I mean, ironically, like you said, pulling in some of these Silver Age callbacks, like the stretching, but really moving the character forward. And then he gets involved with Project Cadmus. I mean, there's so much going on in these issues. And we find out that his father, long thought dead, had actually been military liaison to Project Cadmus, and then had been captured and killed, but also cloned. And Jimmy's mother goes looking for him. She gets captured. Jimmy finally rescues her by the end of the issues that we read. Jimmy teams up with the Guardian and the Newsboy Legion. Like there's a ton of stuff going on. But at the end of the day, I mean, that genuine tension there between Superman and Jimmy. It was really cool to see that play out. And like I said, I'm excited to see how they get past that.
No, I agree. And that tension carries over also in Jimmy's relationship with Clark.
Yeah.
Right. Because Clark is becoming colder and colder toward the people in his life as the Eradicator's influence, deepens. So you're watching Jimmy Olsen now lose connection with essentially his two best friends, who are essentially, we know the same person. And you really feel for the guy. I mean, he's not only is he dealing with his own stuff, his hair falls out, for God's sake. He gets stuck in this colorless void, this dimension where he's sort of besieged by these, monsters before he can finally find a way to escape. I mean, he really kind of is dragged through the mud in these stories. And at the core of it, the thing that means the most, at least to me as a reader, was that he didn't feel like he had anybody to turn to, I mean, he turns to Emil Hamilton, who basically throws him in a glass tube for several days and then has no sympathy when he's like, I'm really bored and I don't want to be in here anymore. So he's upset about that. And Clark and or Superman would be the people he turned to, and he doesn't have them. It's, I really felt a lot of sympathy for Jimmy in these issues.
As did I. And, I mentioned the Project Cadmus. It's funny because I think as fans, there's the characters and concepts that we like and characters and concepts we don't. In prior episodes, I talked about how I'm just not a fan of Silver Banshee. And so I think actually the first issue of Superman that we read as part of this was her origin, and that was fine. And I couldn't tell you why. It's never, the character's never done anything for me. Project Cadmus, on the other hand, I love. I've always been a fan. I guess because they played a large role in the immediate post Death of Superman period. I don't know, maybe that's why. But so it was cool to see those characters get some play. When you talked about, Superman. So Superman, obviously is clearly under the influence of the Eradicator in the latter issues that we read. And again, it starts small. Like there are these little references to him, oh, it's logical, things like that. And then it builds, and then it's so clear that something's wrong with him. But I wanted to get your take on going back to the gangbuster episode. I wanted to get your take. What was your reading on the extent to which Brainiac was responsible for this psychotic break? Because Superman has a couple of battles with the Milton Fine incarnation of Brainiac before all the gangbuster stuff starts. And in one of those encounters, Brainiac is messing with his mind and bringing up his dark side and things like that. And then in later issues, when we deal with Brainiac again, Superman is kind of like recapping everything and reflecting on, on those battles with Brainiac. And I guess what was your take? I mean, because I have an opinion on it, but I wanted to get your take. I mean, to what extent was Brainiac responsible for the gangbuster episode?
So I don't know that I certainly didn't connect them at first, because again, that first Brainiac issue felt like a one-off. Again, we had a Silver Banshee issue, a Rampage issue, and then we had this Brainiac issue. So, I wasn't really connecting it to the larger story because there really wasn't a lot of that continuity in those first couple issues leading up to Exile. So I didn't expect Brainiac to be the big deal that he ended up being. I mean, he's got a trilogy coming up, at post Exile. So I don't think I really put a whole lot of mental weight behind that connection. What I did find interesting as Brainiac developed into a much more serious threat, of course, we end up finding out that he's essentially the disembodied consciousness of the Kaluan Vril-Dox, who was presumed dead, but sent his consciousness out into the ether, and it ended up in Milton Fine's body. That we always think of Superman as having two weaknesses, right? It's kryptonite and it's magic, but psionics also seem to be a bit of a soft spot for him, right? I mean, he has a mind. He's not, he doesn't particularly protect himself from that. So anybody who has any sort of mental manipulation seems like they can get to Superman. So looking back on it now, it seems as though it's as good a reason as any to explain why he ends up having the psychotic break that leads to Gangbuster. But I don't know that I saw a direct correlation, at least at first.
Okay, so I'd be curious to get other takes on this as well. If anyone has an opinion, because I don't know. I think it's left kind of open. I mean, I don't think it was an accident that it came up again after Superman returned to Earth. I guess my preference. I don't necessarily like the idea. If the intention was that the battle with Brainiac, facilitated this break, I don't know that I quite love that. I think I think it's vastly more interesting if it was truly the guilt that drove Superman over the edge. Also, I'll use another DC character as an example. When Hal Jordan became Parallax, he murdered the Guardians and the rest of the Green Lantern Corps. So in order to reinstate him as a hero in Green Lantern Rebirth, it had to have been that he was manipulated. It couldn't be that he just lost it, right? Otherwise, I don't think there's any way to really redeem the character. Here, when Superman is acting as Gangbuster, he's rougher, but he doesn't kill anybody. He doesn't do anything that, can't be taken back. So I don't think you need to give him an out. Again, at the same time, just given the way the stories unfold, I mean, I do think my gut is that the intention was that the Brainiac manipulation played a role. I guess if I had to make a ruling on it, I think it was maybe, I don't know, necessary, but not sufficient. Like, I don't think absent the guilt, I don't think that, the battle with Brainiac would have led to that break. But had that battle with Brainiac not happened, I don't know that he goes that far as to become Gangbuster and not realize it. That's kind of where but again, big picture, I don't, I really just like the idea that the guilt, kind of tore him up and he did this.
So maybe a reasonable compromise is that Brainiac's attack, sort of softened him up, made him more susceptible to
Yeah.
his own guilt. Whereas before that, the guilt may not have caused a full psychotic break, but it's still there and it's very powerful. This just pushed it over the edge.
Yeah, I'll go with that. We talked before about some of the subplots. Was there anything more scintillating than Lex's hostile takeover or potential hostile takeover? I was there for that, man. I thought that was pretty good.
So what's interesting is that it's a backup feature across like 3 or 4 different issues where the main story is like the first 18 pages and you get like a 4-page or so Lex Luthor hostile takeover. It's not in the Exile trade. The hostile takeover stories are not included. So it was only when I went back to the app and I actually saw the covers that advertise at the bottom. There's the banner that says there's this other story. So I had to go into the app and actually read the hostile takeover thing. I loved that. I thought that was really, really cool, especially because we know that when Byrne took over Superman, he took what the Lex Luthor character, which had typically been portrayed as sort of the mad scientist type in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s, and gave him a makeover for the 80s, right? The Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, greed is good, model where he's this ruthless businessman. He's a genius still, but instead of creating tech himself, he generally shells out money to various scientists or organizations who kind of do it for him. And I love that take. And it's certainly as relevant now as it was then. But I thought it was a really interesting storyline. But I couldn't help thinking, would I have liked that as a 12-year-old? It's essentially corporate manipulation, right? Stock market manipulation. I don't know that I would have gotten it or enjoyed it, but I was reading it now, so I thought it was great.
It's so funny you say that because I had a very similar thought because the premise of it is that he wants this psionics lab that Star Labs owns so that he can study Brainiac, who he currently has in captivity. And so over the course of, these few issues, he teases a potential takeover of Star Labs. And, it drives up the stock price. But anyway, he's got it all planned out. And basically, he anticipates that Star Labs will recognize that Lex wants Star Labs for that psionics lab. So they decide to sell it such that, Lex won't want anything to do with what's left of Star Labs. He just wants that other piece. But Lex is so clever that he set up this dummy corporation to be the purchaser of that psionics lab. But on top of all of that, like they even go so far as to get into the poison pill. Like Star Labs issues all these additional shares. I was reading it. And, I'm going back to my corporations class from law school, and I'm like, I can't believe like they're getting this in the weeds on it. It was so funny. But to your point, it's like, yeah, I don't know, for a kid reading at the time, I found it interesting. What I like more than anything else, and you hit the nail on the head. I like that you actually got to see how Lex went about his business in a deeper way than, him just directing, his doctors to study Brainiac. Like you actually got to see how he did business. It was pretty cool.
I agree. I thought that was, I love businessman Lex. That's my favorite interpretation of the character. I will say, I didn't love the visual Lex in here. For he's just sort of like doughier,
Yeah,
than I prefer my Lex to be, and I think Byrne sort of started that, and these artists are just picking up from that. So I don't actually blame the artists here. If there's blame to to cast, it would be on Byrne, but I like a sort of svelte Lex Luthor who is in his own way physically imposing as well as a cerebral threat. That's just me personally.
no, and because I did notice, and they numerous characters refer to him as Fat Man, the Fat Man,
Yeah.
and it just made me think of Kingpin. He's not drawn that large, But it was kind of like in that vein. And no, I'm with you. I do like a more physically imposing Lex. And later on, we will get that. Certainly when he's posing as his own son, Lex Luthor II. And then after his clone body is rejuvenated in the Underworld Unleashed storyline in the late 90s, then he is the physically fit Lex. And I do think that is more effective. But yeah, I did clock that myself. It's just the way he was depicted and the numerous references to him as Fat Man. But yeah, the Hostile Takeover subplot, that was cool. I know you were not a huge fan of the Mixius Pitalik issue where Lex has to defend the city. And was it my favorite issue of the run? No, but I kind of like the idea that absent Superman, it fell on Lex, and I also love that Lex basically missed Superman when he was in space. Like he missed having that, that sparring partner there. So I enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, it did bring out an aspect of Lex that I often enjoy, and I'm going to make a very strange analogy, but they kind of touched on it in the Lego Batman movie, when essentially the Lego Joker, you know, uh, tries to make the case that Batman isn't Batman without the Joker, right? And the Joker isn't the Joker without Batman, right? They need each other. They're the yin and the yang, and I think Lex sees himself and Superman in much the same way. I think he really sees Superman as that necessary foil, and without Superman, he's sort of that proverbial general without a war to fight. And to that point, I mean, he won't even allow anybody else to be the one to finally defeat Superman. It's got to be him. I mean, he stopped somebody. I'm trying to remember who,
Well,
but somebody was about to kill him.
well, so they recapped this, so this might be what you're referring to.
Okay,
But in
maybe that's it.
Superman number one, number one, I mean, Metallo's got Superman on the ropes, and then Lex intervenes and takes him away because he's like, no, like that's that's for me to do. Uh, so that's going back to the first issue, and they do reference that here because Metallo does come back and ends up working with Brainiac. I mean, yeah, that the Brainiac storyline and the Brainiac Luthor piece that gets a lot of play, and like you said, there is that 3-part story in action, the Brainiac trilogy, where by the end of that storyline, we end up with the visual representation of Brainiac that will be with for the rest of the 90s. Where it's the body of Milton Fine, but now genetically modified and green and enhanced, and he builds a ship, the design for which came to him in a dream, a Silver Age dream, because
Yeah.
it resembles the Silver Age Brainiac, and the last we see of him in this run, he's heading off into space, but obviously he'll come back, and I think it's the Panic in the Sky storyline that we still have coming up, where that's a big Brainiac story. While we're talking Lex, I want to shift to another L, Lois. One of the big surprises for me in this reading project thus far, the Byrne stuff and what we read for this episode, was how little development the Lois and Clark relationship has, and it's surprising to me because we the last issue of Superman that we read for this episode is number 43. By 73, the beginning part of the Death of Superman storyline, they're engaged to be married. They're not anywhere even close to that. And I know we have, besides, we have multiple Superman titles, and I know we have a long way to go, but not a ton between them. It was very surprising to me. What about you?
Yeah, I expected to see the relationship at least partly already in motion, right? I expected there to be some sort of romance, but no, I mean, they're friends and they're colleagues. And there are even a couple of mentions where she says, like, man, I never really thought about Clark in that way, but I guess he's like he's a decent guy. And, there is that. And of course they certainly move farther apart as Clark falls victim to the Eradicator. And, he's at this point, he's working for a rival publication, News Time magazine, and he runs into Lois on the street, and she's like, "Hey, you want to, get a cup of coffee?" And he's like, "No, I really have no use for any relationships from that former, my former job." And she is just floored by the fact that he's so dismissive, because it just seems like he's saying that if we're not working together, then we have no relationship whatsoever. Um, and she dismisses him. I mean, as she should. Again, her motivation there is perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable. But when he is restored and he comes back. I thought that she kind of took him back into her life a little too easily, considering how hard he blew her off.
Yeah, I and when she ran into him on the street when he was no longer working for the planet, but he was under the influence of the Eradicator. I might be mixing this up, but I think that was when she offered to cook him dinner.
Oh yeah, yeah. You're right.
Which, reading that, I was like, that was, I mean, I don't know, like that was pretty forward. I mean, she invites him over to her place and she's going to cook him dinner. And that's when he brushes her off under the influence of the Eradicator.
Right.
When they make up, when he returns to the planet and he's no longer eradicated, it's interesting because overall, I agree with you. It's like, I was surprised that she accepted his apology, but I liked it. I felt like, he was genuine with her. He was like, I really wasn't myself. I was pushing everyone away, including my parents. And I think it would have been expected for her to be like, well, too bad. Like, you had your chance and you blew it. I didn't look at it. Like, I didn't think that, oh, she's weak for, accepting his apology. I just felt like he was so genuine in the moment. I like that I think they embrace, like, I thought that was cool. But, overall with this run, and I felt this way reading the Byrne stuff too. I was like really surprised that, it was really, for the most part, tense between the two of them. The rivalry, the fact that he scooped her on the Superman story, like there was a lot of stuff like that. And the beginning part of this run kind of wraps up her non-starter of a romance with Jose Delgado. But I'll be honest, I feel like they sort of reversed course because in the previous, and we talked about this in the a couple episodes ago. I feel like towards the end of the Byrne era, I mean, it seemed like it was going in a direction with Jose, and then I felt like they really pivoted away from that pretty quickly here. But at the same time, yeah, you still didn't get a ton between the two of them. I guess when Superman's off world and Matrix is posing as Clark, um, and or I guess even before that, when a body is found in Clark's apartment, right? Because Intergang has put a hit out on Clark. Again, there's a lot going on in these issues. Intergang has put a hit out on Clark. They end up mistakenly killing the PI that Amanda McCoy had hired, but it seems like it's Clark. So there's this period of time where everyone thinks Clark is dead or might be dead. And I think it's at that point like Lois starts to warm to the idea of him, and she realizes that she had kind of taken him for granted. And then when quote unquote Clark returns, it's Matrix posing as Clark, and he doesn't know what's going on and has like a childlike intellect, and so clearly they kind of hit a wall there. And then later on, like you were talking about, when he's under the influence of the Eradicator, it's like any instance where like she's starting to maybe feel something for him, it's either not him or he's under the influence of something. So again, it was just surprising. I mean, I'm really intrigued to see how this relationship develops, because I feel like they have a lot of ground to cover in an increasingly short period of time.
They do. I mean, to be fair, I mean, between issue 43 where we leave off and 73
Yeah.
when the death of Superman happens, I mean, that's going to be like 2.5 years our time of stories, which is not an unreasonable amount of time considering what we just finished with was them agreeing essentially to go on their first date of a
Right.
kind, right?
Yeah.
Um, but when you outline how many times she has opened herself up to the idea of maybe romantically being involved with Clark, and how many times there's a major barrier to that, and it's always Clark. It's never her. It's always him. That's why it's not that I see her as weak for agreeing to just sort of open herself up to him again at the end of these issues. It's that I can't imagine how anybody would want to be involved with someone who's that inconsistent. Who, when he's good, he's great. But when he's not, he is all over the place. He's just a complete mystery. And so I don't know that I'd want to be with anybody who is a child one day, dead, missing another, then back, then really cold and distant, who's always disappearing. I mean that's always been a staple of the Superman Lois relationship. They're following the lead of a story, and something big happens, and he runs off to be Superman, and she's looking around like, where the heck did Clark go? I just to me it just seemed like a bridge too far for her to do that.
Your point is well taken. I do think that, that we've had other instances, and actually Superman and Lois, when you get to this episode, because they do a flashback episode where you get to see the very beginnings of their relationship. I know there's some snippets in the pilot, but there's a later episode that spends a lot more time there. And it's a version of the story where all the questions that you just raised are not there. It's like you watch that episode and it's like, oh, like, man, you see why Lois would fall in love with Clark and so, I think there are other depictions of this romance that track a little bit better. I think that, when you do look at all of this in sum, it's kind of like, it is a little questionable. But again, it was a surprise of mine to see how little development really the romance had. And I'm curious to see where it goes, as we're moving forward. What else about this run, particularly anything that we haven't talked about yet that you might have in your notes there?
Okay, so I really enjoy seeing the first appearance of Maxima, because I know she becomes a Justice Leaguer in the next couple of years, and to see her appear as this alien woman who is such a superior specimen, in her own mind, and to be fair, fairly objectively, I think she is, right. I mean, she's beautiful, she's powerful, she's confident, she's got a lot going for her, and she's scouring the universe for a male being, right? I'm still in sort of traditional gender roles here, but binary thinking. But she's looking for a male counterpart who's every bit the paragon that she is, and she happens upon Superman of Earth, and she wants to make him hers. And so she sends this scout ahead of her, right, which is a simulacrum of herself, right, a sort of a copy of herself, along with an emissary, Sazu, and they're basically going to, if he won't go along with this, they're just going to take him. And he fights back, and then eventually Maxima herself actually, makes herself known, and it's the same thing. And she and Superman sort of fight a little bit, but it resolves itself. And it was interesting to see this portrayal of the character. And again, I'm trying to figure out what could possibly happen between now and when she becomes a Justice Leaguer, because she's pretty terrible.
It's true. And because I guess the version of the character I met as a reader, was an ally, even if it was a little tenuous. So it was definitely cool to see the beginnings of that. She was not as, I don't know, maybe I was conflating her a little bit with the character Obsession. Do you remember Obsession from later in the 90s? She lived up to her name and was obsessed and in love with Superman.
I don't.
And I feel like I might have been conflating them a little bit because, Maxima definitely is, projects strength, I feel above all else. It was interesting to see her. I'm glad you brought up Maxima, because I'm kind of on the note of, I don't know, I guess Superman's place in the DC universe. We have a couple of other appearances. My buddy and previous podcast guest would kill me if I didn't mention Lobo. So Justin DeVoe is a shout out to Justin. It's his favorite character. Lobo appears here, trying to take out Superman, and they fight at the fortress with Bibbo along for the ride.
Who he calls Yo-Yo.
Yeah, and they're just wasted. They're just like the entire time they're just wasted. There's also,
was this his first post-crisis? This was first appearance, or
not first appearance? First interaction with Superman, I guess. Yeah. Beyond that, though, I'll be honest, I'm not particularly well versed in the history of Lobo necessarily. So I know it's not his first appearance, and I don't think it's even his first post-crisis appearance. But yeah, definitely first, as far as I know, in interaction with Superman post-crisis. We also get an issue where Mxyzptlk forces the Flash and Superman to race. That was really cool because, and I know you're a fellow fan of the Jeff Johns run on the Flash, the Mark Waid run too.
I haven't read the whole Mark Waid run.
Okay, neither have I actually, but that's going to be changing on this podcast. By the way, we'll get back to that later. But those two writers in particular, they did so much to have to evolve Wally and to actually have him grow into the role. But this was cool to see because this was a Wally earlier in his journey. Still struggling under the shadow of Barry Allen, still trying to prove himself, a little bit more of a hothead. And so he has this race with Superman, and he like wins by a hair, and which I'm glad for. I always have the opinion that it's his one thing, he should be faster. But that was cool, and I enjoyed that dynamic between the two of them in that issue.
Yeah, if you're going to do a one-off, that's the way to do it. I think and I enjoyed that Mixes-Pitalik appearance a lot more than I enjoyed the other one during Exile. So getting to see a couple of the other Justice Leaguers as they're watching the race, sort of weighing in on, some of them have more of a relationship with Wally, some of them have more of a relationship with Superman, and so to see where they stand is really fun. Um, I also thought Superman was really hard on Wally. I mean, at one
Yes.
point they're racing, and he says like, you seem to be talking about Barry a lot. Well, just so you know, like you've got huge shoes to fill. Like that's a dick move right there.
Yeah, he was very condescending to Bat. Yeah, and that was the point though. He was right. He was under the influence of the Eradicator at that
I
point,
think
but
he
not
still
like
was.
all the. Because again, there was definitely this progression. So I don't know. I guess like anything in those preceding issues to the Krypton Man storyline, anything that was kind of a little bit off, I guess you could chalk up to that. But yeah, I definitely had that thought as well. It's like, yeah, you really are a dick. This poor kid.
Yeah.
Oh, speaking of the Krypton Man, just visually speaking, what did you think of that the red and black Kryptonian outfit?
Look, as far as the Byrne redesigns for everything Krypton, um, it makes a lot of sense. That's essentially what we see Jor-El and Lara wearing in those flashback scenes, and the way that they're depicted. So it's a really neat visual way to signal to the reader that what's happening in Clark's mind is more Kryptonian than it is human. So just in terms of like a cartooning shorthand, I thought it worked beautifully, especially during those moments where the suit, which was the Eradicator designed suit, morphed itself
Right.
based on how much of that Kryptonian was sort of coming to the fore. So, at one point he's sort of beating someone down, and the Superman suit sort of morphs into the Kryptonian dress, and then I forget who, but somebody comes in the door, and they call, and he's already sort of morphed back. So they walk in, as far as they know, it's still Superman, but we, the reader, know that in that moment when he was sort of essentially alone, he had that moment where the Kryptonian side came through. So I actually really liked it.
Yeah, so did I for all the reasons you laid out, and just visually, I think it was kind of cool. Comic book artist Ken Marion, I know you're listening. Let me know what you think of that design as well, because he and I've had a lot of talks, and we're actually going to do an episode down the line a little bit about the visual evolution of Superman, and I'm sure we'll talk about kind of some of the variations. I mean, he and I have often discussed the black costume post, resurrection, which we're both fans of. But yeah, I thought this design was pretty cool, and definitely, like you said, thematically. I mean, like really, was a great visual representation of where Clark, aka Kal El, was, in his journey at the time. Speaking of the visuals here, it was fascinating to see. I mean, I enjoyed the art overall, really, for the most part. I have to say, but it was interesting to see the art of Dan Jurgens, and specifically how different it looked depending on the inker. Because I guess I'm most used to seeing him with Brett Breeding, and I feel like that's sort of like when I think of the iconic like Dan Jurgens Superman, that's what I think of. But there's an issue that where he's inked by Klaus Janson, and it's like it looks totally different. I think there's another one, Templeton.
Ty Templeton, yeah.
Ty Templeton. That looks like again, there are numerous instances where he's inked by different people, and it's like it looks very different. So, and not necessarily bad, but it was just I didn't have that instant connection. Where it's like, oh, it's that Dan Jurgens art. Like, it really made a big difference.
Yeah, there are a lot of pencilers who essentially look the same. Their work looks the same, almost regardless of who's inking them. Right? It's such a distinctive style. Jurgens here. you can see the evolution of his work, right? Because we know what it looks like once we get to the sort of death of and everything following that, where he is inked, I think at that point exclusively by Brett Breeding. But I mean, he's inked by Art Bear, he's inked by I think George Perez at certain points.
Yeah, yeah.
Andy Kubert, a very young Andy Kubert, does an issue over him. Like, there's some really interesting takes. But what's funny is, like, when he's being inked by Andy Kubert, it looks like Andy Kubert. When he's inked by Art Bear, it looks like Art Bear. It really does. The inker almost, their style overpowers his, which I also noticed and found fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. That was I definitely clocked that as I was making my way through those issues. But again, it's cool, and just when I started to see him, because I think he did, maybe there were a couple of fill-ins here and there, and then like to see him, to see him more regularly, and then taking over the writing as well. Like it was cool to see, where such a legendary Superman creator got his start on the character. What else do you have in your notes there?
So I had made a note about Matrix, because certainly in the first part of our reading, Matrix plays a huge role. Matrix, this sort of amorphous kind of blob of an alien creature who comes to Earth and it ends up living with the Kents. They almost sort of adopt her. And what's interesting is Matrix takes on a distinctly female persona at first. She's alien, but visually she looks much more traditionally female, and she's referred to by female pronouns. And at the point where that shifts, and when Clark is in exile, and and as you said, there's been this assassination attempt on Clark, and they killed the wrong person, and he's presumed dead. And in order to kind of not arouse suspicion, because the Kents and Matrix know that the real Clark is actually out in space, Matrix morphs her body into Clark Kent's, and takes on the persona of Clark Kent, not of Superman, but of Clark. And it's at that point that everybody starts referring to Matrix by male pronouns. Matrix is now a he, not Clark, but Matrix. So what was interesting to me is, I read this, through the lens of 2021 as, a transgender character. This is a transgender character, right? Her birth gender essentially is female, and through weird sci-fi circumstances, right, she becomes male. And I thought that was really neat. I'm sure that's not what the creators intended back in 1991 or two, or whenever this was, but I couldn't help but see it through that lens. I thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I made a similar connection because where Superman in particular is thinking to himself about the character, and he's struggling with the pronouns himself. It definitely called to mind, exactly the gender, points that you brought up. So, I know, I agree. Probably not the intention, but definitely through the modern lens, you can't help but think that, we still have a long way to go before Matrix becomes Supergirl. Which again is something that I know happens, but I've never actually read the story, so I'm curious. And the last time we see Matrix, they are off world. After initially Matrix thinks that they're Superman, and Superman and Matrix battle, and then finally Matrix leaves Earth, and that's the last that we see of them at the end of this bunch of issues. There's so much stuff where I'm genuinely curious and excited to see how we get, from one point to the next. You had mentioned earlier about Clark going to work for a rival publication. I don't think I ever even knew that this happened. But yeah, Colin Thornton, who he becomes the villain, Satanus, right? If I'm not mixing him up, I think so.
Possible.
I believe so. He owns News Time magazine, and he poaches Clark, and Clark makes the decision to leave, during the whole Eradicator saga. But, that was an interesting thing. And, it didn't it got play, but it mostly got play in the context of, showing Clark becoming increasingly cold and Kryptonian. But just the idea of him leaving and taking on this role of an editor, I thought was cool. And I loved, Perry gave him a lot of great advice. And I loved the send off that the Daily Planet gave him, that they looked like they were giving him the cold shoulder, but then they threw him this party. I have to say, Perry overall, because I found that, especially in on-screen depictions, not all the time, but sometimes, and I'm especially thinking of the George Reeves show, Perry can be exceedingly gruff. But I found that this Perry is quite understanding and, paternal at times, and definitely, is someone who cares, and that comes across a lot. I like this depiction of Perry White.
Yeah, he was a lot softer.
Yeah.
And we saw that in a couple of ways. The one that there are two that I particularly liked. One was, there were several members of the Daily Planet staff, Lois included, who really don't like the fact that Clark has abandoned the planet, and because they think of themselves not just as a staff, but really as a family. And somebody leaving is a personal affront. It's not just that he's making a professional decision. It feels like a personal affront, right? Um, Perry, the conversation he has with Perry, it seems like Perry understands someone's need to kind of move beyond the place where they've been for several years, right? I mean, Clark has been a reporter for so many years. So for him to get to go somewhere else and be a managing editor, which is a position Perry can't offer him,
Right.
you know, to love somebody enough to say, I will be sad to let you go, but I just want you to be happy and fulfilled in whatever way you can do that. And so he sends him off, as you said, with advice, right? He's not he doesn't at least appear to be resentful. And then the other way that we see him really being paternal was when he finds out that one of his employees, this intern, Allie,
Yeah.
is homeless and has been living in the storeroom for like 2 years. And his first instinct is, number one, well, it's Christmas time, of course, too. So, spirit of giving. And first of all, you're coming home with me. You're going to come home and you're going to have a nice home cooked meal. And then it's at that point that he springs on her with his own wife, who's also named Alice, that she can live there essentially until she has enough money to get back on her feet, which he will provide by giving her essentially the back pay for all the extra hours that she's done and give her sort of a promotion. And so he provides this opportunity for her in this really wonderful way, and then goes on beyond that and like writes this editorial that we see all of at the end of that issue, where he asks everybody who's reading the paper to not assume that the homeless person on the street is just some worthless bum, but rather, that it could be somebody who just has fallen on hard times, is just going through some stuff. And instead of casting them aside, maybe lend a hand, do something tangible. Don't just throw your money to the local charity, but actually do something to help these people. And I thought, what a progressive, listen, comics lately have come under fire for, creators sort of having a sort of a liberal agenda that some fans don't love. I mean, it was right here. I mean, this is essentially the liberal agenda at work, but it's really beautiful to see. I love that aspect of Perry.
As did I, and I love that issue in particular, that Christmas issue. I thought it was very heartwarming. Well, while we're talking about the Daily Planet journalism side of things, when one thing that we're told a lot about, but we're not shown a ton of, is Clark's expose on Intergang. Which, it's funny, we got all these pages on Lex's hostile takeover and the poison pill and all this corporate maneuvering. It's like, I would have loved to have seen Clark actually investigating Intergang. It sounded really fascinating. But the thing that really made me laugh was, when Clark decides he's going to leave Earth to exile himself, he tells Perry, he's like, there's a lot of heat from Intergang because of this series, this expose series that I'm writing. So I gotta get underground, right? But I'm going to mail you installments. And, before he leaves Earth, right, he gives Ma and Pa like all of these articles and tells them to, mail them every couple of weeks. And the thing I just kept thinking was like, this sounds like really like important, valuable information about Intergang. why are you parsing it out? This feels like something that the public and the police should know, like, all in one shot.
I mean, it's important enough that someone put a hit out on him for it.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Well, and it's just like, well, so clearly the entire thing is pre-written. So it's like, it really made me laugh. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the Intergang stuff, again, except when Morgan Edge is like actually putting hits out on them, you know, the actual investigating, all of that just kind of happens, you know, more off panel. But, you know, at least it does speak to Clark's, you know, investigative prowess and why he is this, you know, this top reporter. We also find out during this run of issues that, you know, Morgan Edge, he thought he was working for Darkseid, but it was actually Desaad posing as Darkseid. You know, it's funny because in the lead up to this, I was saying to myself, like, what is Darkseid's agenda here? It's like, why would he be this involved in Intergang? It just feels so small and pedestrian for this god. And I mean, honestly, I still have the same question, even if it's Desaad. But I mean, basically, it just comes down to he wants to sow chaos. That's basically it, which is fine, I guess. Maybe I was hoping for a little bit more of an explanation. And then, you know, Morgan Edge, he has a heart attack. He's in the hospital for a bit. He's got his legal issues. And then his father, Vincent Edge, emerges and gets his seat back on the board. And I know we're gonna have more play there too. But there's that. And Cat Grant turned out to be the informant all along. You know, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, but I genuinely enjoyed Cat Grant during the Byrne era for the most part. And I thought she emerged as like a surprisingly viable romantic interest for Clark. I really liked their relationship because, again, this was especially, again, in that Byrne era in particular, where, again, things between Lois and Clark were super, no pun intended, frosty. And I actually liked, you know, with Kat, and, you know, I like that, you know, Kat did have baggage and, you know, she had her son that, who, you know, she didn't have custody of, and, you know, the alcoholism. There was a lot of stuff going on with Kat, but I thought it was interesting, and I liked the relationship between the two of them, and that really took a back seat. I feel like with, you know, with Lois and Jose and with Clark and Kat, I feel like they really pivoted away from those romances. But yeah, that's what she was up to during this period too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of two minds because on the one hand, I don't think you need a romance to add into everything else that's going on. I mean, I know that, you know, obviously there are plenty of readers who, you know, would love that angle, and for them maybe this was missing. But, you know, if you're not going to do it with Lois, right? If there isn't going to be the romantic relationship there, yeah, I'm with you. I would have liked to see it maybe explored in other ways, especially if these creators knew down the line that it was always going to come back to Lois. And I think it's fairly safe to say that at least somebody knew that it would. So yeah, Cat Grant would have been a great avenue to explore. Even Lana, because several times, you know, there are Smallville visits, and most of them include Lana. And I could see that relationship starting to rekindle itself as they're now adults, right? We know that they were childhood sweethearts, but you know, to do something with that here, even if it ultimately didn't work out in the long run, I think would have been really neat. And the fact that we don't get really any sort of, you know, romantic entanglements for Clark in these issues maybe felt like a slight omission.
You're always you and Rich Roney fall into the same category of, you know, always very diplomatic and respectful. And I get what you're saying. And, you know, I guess the way I look at it too, especially in, you know, with the benefit of hindsight now, I guess, and really taking this long view of Superman, you know, pre-Crisis, it's like they just, as much as, you know, with Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane, but it's like they never went there. They never had a relationship, right? And, you know, there were, you know, and there was the, you know, Lana and Lois competing, but again, they never went there. It's not like Superman ever picked and they ever dated or anything like that. And then, you know, now that we know the layout of post-Crisis Superman, you know, within just a couple of years, as we talked about before, he'll be with Lois, and he'll be with Lois moving forward. I mean, I know the New 52 played around with, you know, a Wonder Woman instead, but it's like now taking a long view of the character in comics, it's like, there was this very tiny window post-Crisis where where the stories were actually, I guess, you know, mature enough at that point where they would go down the road of a romance. that little window before it becomes just Lois. I was like, yeah, I kind of wish that, that we could have seen him in more of a relationship with someone else. And I agree. I mean, I think they could have done something with Lana there. I mean, she kisses him before he leaves for his exile. I mean, there's something there. That's why too, I really think you're going to enjoy the Superman and Lois show when you finish the season. I was thinking about this. I truly think, and you know what a massive Smallville fan I am. However, I truly think that Superman and Lois is the best treatment Lana has gotten as a character, really in any medium. And as much as they saddled her with a husband who didn't seem all that great initially, over the course of the season, I think they do a good job of fleshing him out, showing, why she would be with him, and also giving him some redeeming qualities. Because at the beginning, I was like, oh man, like they just, just like Lana was with Whitney at the start of the Smallville show. I was like, oh, she's with this guy. And, now Clark has moved back to Smallville. She's going to pine for him. And they didn't do that. And we're only in season 1, but I give them a lot of credit. So I think the Superman and Lois show has really gone a long way towards, not undoing, but like maybe a little making up for the way Lana's been treated, particularly in the comics, which has, not been great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I regret that was just a show that sort of fell outside of. In the next couple of weeks, I plan to catch up.
Gotcha. You dropped out there for a second, but I think I picked up what you were saying, that you fell out of the show, but you're hoping to catch up in the near future.
Yeah.
Right on. So I think I've pretty much said everything that I wanted to about this period that we read for this. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
I have one last thought on this, and I wanted specifically, because we've danced around it a bit, I want to specifically call out some of the creators who really surprised me in some great ways. I will say I have a new appreciation for Jerry Ordway, both as a writer as an artist. I It's not that I disliked him. I never had any particular reason to not appreciate his work. It just never pleased me aesthetically in ways that other artists had. Um, and reading these issues, I don't know whether it's the age that I am or the other comics that I've seen, I thought his work was exemplary. I really did, both in the writing and the art. I thought his cartooning was so expressive. His line work was so textured. It was so wonderful. So I have a new appreciation for Jerry Ordway, and a really undervalued creator who I guess was big in this era, and then you just didn't see him very much. Kerry Gamble was so good. I mean, it was so the first issue of Exile. As soon as I open up the book, boom, there's a Kerry Gamble splash page. I went, this is really good. Without all the bells and whistles of like, digital coloring and all that stuff. Like it is the art kind of unadulterated, and it's really beautiful. His page layouts, his figure work, he really is doing some exceptional things. To me, the standout writer of all this was Roger Stern.
Yeah.
Right. And again, like, he's up there, a lot of times as an Avengers writer, but I just, his dialogue to me sort of read the most naturally. His pacing, I really appreciated what he was doing. And then to me, the single superstar of this is editor Mike Carlin, because an editor in this era is the guy who's keeping everything running when you've got 3 different titles that are all sort of alternating with each other, with all of the subplots that we've now explored. So there's got to be one person who keeps it all straight and all running, and that's him. And having the foresight to basically take two letterers throughout this entire run, right? You got Albert de Guzman and Bill Oakley, who are doing the majority of it. John Costanza comes in every now and again, and Glenn Whitmore on colors for the entire run, right? I mean, and this keeps going. This is going to go on and on well into the Death era. Like, to have the variety of artists that we have, there's got to be a consistent look and feel that marks this as a Superman title. Even if you open the book and Superman's not on that page, right? Can you recognize that this is a Superman book? And if you look at the lettering and you look at the coloring, it reads as a Superman title. So that's the glue that's kind of keeping this all together. And we often forget about sort of some of those unsung heroes, but I wanted to call them out for what I thought was really extraordinary work.
Well said. I don't disagree with any of that. And, specifically on the note of the editing and the coordination overall, again, I mean, this was a different, because again, during the Byrne era, there was that to an extent, but Byrne was the primary force. By the end of the Byrne era, he was writing all 3 titles and drawing 2 of them. So here now you're dealing with a larger number of creators, and, they didn't have the benefits of modern technology that we enjoy today. So the fact that they were able to keep all those plates spinning, keep everything in order, keep all those subplots straight, the level of coordination, among the creators and certainly, from the editing standpoint was really tremendous. I agree with that. And, I echo the creators you called out as well. I mean, with Ordway in particular is one who, again, I'd never, disliked or anything like that, but I definitely have a newfound appreciation, especially because, he was the main guy who carried over from the Byrne era. And I think really, that helped the books have a strong sense of continuity. They do give Byrne credit in at least one issue, if not a couple more, talking about how he set up a lot of the stuff that they would play off in these issues. And again, I don't know if this was exactly what Byrne was intending. When he had Superman kill the villains in the Pocket Universe, was he intending to do this Exile story? I don't know, but clearly that gave them a great place to go moving forward. I guess the last thing I wanted to mention was, I did think of one more thing. In that Exile story, it was interesting to see like where he went on his space odyssey. And, the first world he goes to, it's a hospitable world. And it seems like, it could be a place for him, but right off the bat, he ends up saving a space shuttle. And, upon, landing, he's swarmed by, all the citizens of this planet. And it is a direct echo of what happened when he made his debut in Metropolis, and everyone wanted a piece of him. And, so he realizes like, I'm going to fall into the same cycle as I did before. And I thought that was really interesting. He also ends up like inside a space creature, and he ends up on worlds that are not hospitable. The most heartbreaking part, even more so than Warworld, which I know was traumatic, but even the most heartbreaking part was when he found that world that was just covered in grain in these fields that he was going to farm. And he builds a little hut for himself. And it's like, he's getting back to his roots. He grew up on a farm. Like, he can just be at peace with himself here. And then everything is washed away in a flood. And it becomes clear that this is something that happens on a regular basis. There's a reason why this planet is uninhabited. And then as he's leaving, he's just like pelted by, space debris. And, it punctures his breathing apparatus. But it was so heartbreaking, because it's like, yeah, that, if you're going to exile yourself and be alone, for that character in particular, that's pretty perfect. And to have that taken away like that, I really felt for the character in that issue in particular.
Yeah, that would have offered him the peace that he was seeking, right? Because he in solitude, without the fear of hurting anybody, because that's why he exiled himself in the first place, right? He was afraid he was going to hurt somebody. This would have provided him with the time and the space to process without putting anybody in danger, and it was looking perfect. And yeah, it was stolen. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, Scott, we've gone for just under 2 hours. I thank you very, very much for this discussion. I really enjoyed this. I think you and listeners could, I was really excited. I so enjoyed what we read. I'm so looking forward to what's to come, but this was a great conversation. I appreciate the conversation and all of your insight. I really appreciate your willingness to take on this reading project. Because we've been talking about this for months and months and months, and I've given you numerous outs because I'm like, you're also doing the next 2 episodes. by the time we're done with parts 4, 5, and 6 of this podcast event, you and I will have read and discussed about 150 issues of Superman comics.
Is that the record?
Yes. On this podcast? Yes.
Yeah.
For sure. That is the record. I don't know if and when anyone would even come close to that. So I mean, and I know, I know you enjoy these reading projects, but still, I appreciate you being willing to take them on, and the fact that you take them on, with as much passion and care as you do. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does as well. So thank you.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Listen, it has been one of the thrills of the last couple of years of my life to be able to, to go from being a listener of your podcasts to being a sometime guest on them. So I appreciate the opportunity. Just like you, I having these conversations with you about this stuff feeds my soul. So thanks for having me back again. I look forward to the next 2.
Yeah, so you'll be back for parts 5 and 6. Audience, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you've been enjoying our 8-part event. We're now at the halfway point. So Scott and I will be back here in 1 week. Remember, this is a weekly event, so we'll be back in 1 week with part 5 of Crisis Till Death. We'll be covering the next 50 or so issues of Superman comics from this period. So you don't want to miss it. And until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. Join the conversation by becoming part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network Facebook group. Follow Digging for Kryptonite on Instagram and Twitter, and visit flatsquirrelproductions.com to explore more of my film and podcast projects.